So thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I'm going to be talking about some of the work that we've been doing with CSA over the past year and a half, in particular around creating the SDG mapping case studies. So the one that I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail today is the work that we've done around CSA's S501, moderating the effects of permafrost degradation on existing building foundations. So to start with a bit of background on the SDG case studies, this was part of the overall project that was intended to investigate the linkages that had been identified through the original mapping process. Our hope was that providing a number of case studies would give us some examples that could facilitate people's understanding of the SDGs, and more specifically, the role of standards in working towards their implementation. So it would help justify the work that we've done and help people understand how standards can be more than they say. So to explore the linkages through not just the words of the standard, but through actual implementation and experience to understand some of the full reach of the standards that we implement and why they can be such an important part of the work that we do in trying to reach the SDG goals. So myself and the Niagara College team explored two standards in particular as part of these case studies. The first one was CSA S501 on oil and gas pipelines. And we chose that standard because it really does what I just talked about. An oil and gas pipeline standard isn't inherently obvious from a sustainable development practice, but when you think about what the implications of implementing that standard are, they become more evident. A technically sound, effective oil and gas pipeline obviously provides an enormous amount of protection to the land and water and species within it. It provides reliable infrastructure for energy distribution, and if preserves product, it helps work towards climate change because we simply don't need to produce as much energy on the way through. The one that we're going to explore a little bit further, though, is the one on S501, moderating the effects of permafrost. So to start with a bit of background, S501 is a really interesting standard. It was part of a suite of 11 standards that CSA identified along with guidelines to address issues specifically within Northern Canada. So CSA developed the group of documents as part of the Standard Council of Canada's National Infrastructure Standardization Initiative. So this one specifically was published first in 2014. It was reaffirmed in 2019, and then it was the new version of the standard was revised and published in 21, so it's quite recent. The overall NICI group of standards was created to address the threat of climate change in northern communities and to increase both the knowledge base and the sharing of best practices available to those living in the northern communities. And this is important because in many cases, the links to the SDGs are obvious. While it was intended, though, primarily to be used by engineers, architects, and other related government officials, it also does a really good job of creating plain language descriptions of permafrost loss and impacts, plus sharing best practices that can be used by educators, the general public, and other groups to build community knowledge regarding the subject area, because as we developed the standards, it became very clear that shared knowledge didn't exist. So the standard itself was created to generate best practices regarding building maintenance and design that would help preserve permafrost and to also prevent the loss of critical infrastructure within northern communities due to the permafrost collapse. So when we think about the SDGs, you can start to understand how these connections can be broader than simply the words of the standard. So the CSA standard was linked when it was originally mapped to 3 SDGs, number 9 on industry, innovation, and infrastructure, number 11 on sustainable cities and communities, and number 13 on climate action. So when we create a linkage, the intent is that the user implementing the standard could clearly demonstrate how they're working towards the goals and some of the targets underneath these standards in a really robust and credible way. So the standard itself clearly contributes to the health and well-being of the communities in the north due to preservation and creation of livable buildings, which then further reduces the economic costs to the community because it's preserving this critical infrastructure, and it contributes to sustainable building use of resources in the north. By preserving the permafrost and creating that sustainable infrastructure, the requirements in the standard help build resilient communities that are able to withstand the impacts of climate change and also contribute to climate change adaptation. So it's primarily used for this infrastructure piece and maintenance of permafrost, but due to the broad implications of the standard, when we went through the case study, standards users said that it doesn't just apply to buildings, but also general structures that are built on top of the ground. And it made the impact of the standard much more than it was originally intended. CSA S501 was also used by a lot of the users that we talked about to educate the clients and the owners that they worked with, to help them explain the science and the reasoning behind the processes and the costs and the investments that they're making in the north. So it was very, very helpful. The standard is also currently listed for reference within the Government of Yukon's technical design standards, which is really important because it starts to become integrated into existing legislative frameworks. But most importantly for this one, there's potential for the standard to be linked and referenced in the National Building Code. And if that's the case, including that reference within the National Building Code would allow the standard's climate change adaptation methodology and the standard that they've set for preservation of permafrost not to just be best practice, but to be required for compliance. So that would obviously be quite game changing. Basically, if higher expectations were put in place for building design, it would increase short-term maintenance and design costs, but it would greatly reduce the future risk that many communities are seeing in the north. So when we went through the case studies, we used a number of methodologies. We looked at the standard itself in detail. We obviously used the UN SDG website. We looked at published material where it was referenced around legislation and even media. But the majority of the information that we obtained for the case studies was from interviews of the standards users and members of the technical committee. So it helped us explore these on a bit deeper level. For SDG 9, this linkage didn't require too much work because obviously the SDG is fundamentally linked to the purpose of the standard. One of the users, this is a quote from one of the users, in order for infrastructure to be resilient in northern communities, it simply has to address issues of climate change, resilience to work, and to preserve permafrost so that all of the surrounding structures are there. So this one was not a difficult stretch for us. Some of the less obvious, linked to SDG and target 9.1 specifically in this case. Some of the less obvious ones were around SDG 11, around making cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. Obviously, if we're preserving building infrastructure, maintaining the housing stock is really critical. One of the things that we noted in the interviews is that there's a significant housing crunch up there. And so we simply can't be losing the infrastructure that we have to issues of climate change resilience. And by implementing these types of measures, we can extend the lifespan of a building from, say, 20 years to 30 years. So it creates a longer term, more sustainably urbanly planned infrastructure basis for safe and cost-effective housing. So very, very critical. So in particular, it supports the target 11.1, which focuses on that piece of ensuring access for all to adequate, safe, and affordable housing and basic services, which is very much a work in progress based on the discussions that we had with the group. So then our last one was around SDG 13. So taking urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. So all of the requirements and recommendations in this standard focus on permafrost preservation. So it results in climate change resilience, it contributes to adaptation. And so while the climate connection isn't explicitly stated, all of the users felt very clearly that the two targets, 13.1 and 13.3, were very clearly linked to that, and any implementation in the standard would support these two targets and the overall goal. So first of all, target 13.1, strengthening resilience and adaptive capacity to climate-related hazards and natural disasters. And then 13.3, improving the education, awareness raising, and human and institutional capacity on climate change. The technical committee, when writing this, consolidated a lot of information around the discussion of adaptation to climate change in the north, as well as the wording around permafrost, and they compared a lot of the science and best practices. And so the ability to use this tool as a conversation starter for a lot of the architects and engineers that we spoke to was really game-changing for them. So this is just a very quick overview of the work that we did specifically around S501, but the intent was to show you the level to which we explored these, the types of evidence that we looked for as part of the case studies, so that you can feel confident that when these SDGs are mapped to standards and you choose to implement them as a tool, that you can feel confident that you'll be working towards these same types of targets. So we have another case study that we're going to share. My colleague Ruben Berga will take over, and he'll talk about the work that they did. But on the whole, we found that the case study concept was a very useful dive into how effective the mapping system was and how effective standards as a whole can be for implementing and working towards the SDGs. Thank you.